So we started in the last module working with the database diagrams, and these are really great as you're working to build foreign key and primary key relationships because it helps you get a good visual of how the data links together. So I'd like to dig a little deeper into these relationships and talk about things that have to do with database integrity and data integrity. So what can often happen is that when you start to build primary and foreign key relationships between tables is that if a record gets deleted in a referencing table, in a table that you have a foreign key to, if that primary key record gets deleted, then you end up with what's called an orphaned record. And you're working to try to keep from having orphans appear because then that causes holes in your data. So let's go ahead and build another primary key to foreign key relationship and kind of explore this data integrity. So I'm going to go ahead and go from books, and books being my primary key of ID, to the book underscore ID, which will be my foreign key on the other side. So I'm going to grab ID here and I'm going to drag it to book underscore ID. And what SQL is going to do is it's going to pop up and it's going to walk me through some kind of quote unquote wizards. So the first thing is each relationship within your database is given a name. Typically it starts with an FK underscore, and that FK stands for foreign key. So there's a foreign key relationship here between loaner book and the books table, and that's also demonstrated down below here. So the primary key is coming out of the books table and it's the ID column, and then the foreign key is for the loaner book table with book underscore ID column. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So we've established the bare minimums for that relationship. But now we're getting asked the questions around building data integrity and talking about cascade updates and cascade deletes. Now, what this allows you to do, first of all, with the data integrity piece is that if we make no decision around cascading updates and deletes, we're simply saying that if there's a relationship, if we try to delete a record out of one table and if it is part of a foreign key relationship in another table, so another table depends on one of our records that we're trying to delete, SQL Server will actually stop us from being able to delete that record until we delete the record that depends on it. So there's always that kind of dependency relationship that exists. So by building these relationships, we're ensuring that we don't delete a record that may have a reference hanging out there somewhere else. So what that would look like concretely is like if we have somebody that's loaned a book, we can't delete the book until all of the loaner's references to that book are deleted. So let's say we get a book, we take it off the shelf, and we actually want to do a hard delete and delete that book out of our database. Well, we have to go back and delete all of the records in the loaner book that have checked out that book at some point in time. And then once we delete all of those records, then we can go and delete that book. But until we've deleted all of the loaner book records, we can't delete the book itself, and that's part of that referential integrity. So if we were just to leave it at stock, kind of to say, the way it is, we'd simply hit OK, and that would be the relationship that was established. Now we can go in and we can manipulate these relationships as well, and we can do that. This is kind of the properties dialog that's similar to what we were looking at a moment ago. They just put it into a different window. So we have things like table column specifications. These are pretty stock things. This is that first screen that we were looking at, and this is just building those relationships. Checking for existing data and creation. That's again part of that whole data integrity piece. Under the insert and update specifications, if we twirl that open, we have update rules and delete rules. And these rules have to do with what happens if I go in and I delete a book. So if I go in and I delete a book, we can have it cascade, which means that it would then force all of the loaner book records to be deleted as well. We can have it be set to null, which means that all of the book underscore ID fields in the loaner book table would get set to null, or we can have it set to the default. And the default has to do with the way the table design is set up, and it will just resort back to the default value. 9 times out of 10 that either resorts it back to null or may resort it back to a 0. So those are your 3 options. The cascade is the most common one that's used, and I say that meaning that If you have a record like a book and you're actually doing a hard delete, you would want to cascade through the rest of the database and delete the associated data. So that is, of these two sets of rules and the way they work, the cascade is the most common one that's used. Most common, though, is to actually have no action, and that's just, again, to ensure that if you are going to delete a book, that all of the loaner records and any other related records are also deleted prior to deleting the book. The update works in much the same way, where we're dealing with a lot of integer-based primary key fields and identity fields, and for those are auto-number or auto-generated. If you were to make a database design that involved using something like a social security number, let's say, or if you were using a product ID and you had a primary key that was the product ID in the products table, and then you had a foreign key reference to that same product ID in another table, you can do a cascade update. So if that product ID were to change, by changing that record in the primary, by changing the primary key, I should say, in the primary database, the foreign keys in other tables will automatically get updated to the same record to ensure that those records still relate to each other and still line up. Because you can also end up with orphaned records where the records don't have an association, where if you update your primary key and neglect to update your foreign keys. So by doing a cascade update, that ensures that any changes that happen on the primary key will get pushed to all of the related foreign keys. So again, it's most common to set it to no action, and that's to ensure that if data changes are occurring at that degree, that you end up basically getting blocked by the transaction. And that's kind of safe, because then that's saying to you as the user or developer that you have to go in and be intentional about doing updates and deletes as it relates to foreign key records and primary keys. So these allow you to build out that data integrity, and they build constraints around the relationships that your database tables have. And again, those are there to ensure that you've got good data and you're not ending up with orphaned records.